person of faith, as a minister who has been called to preach the good news, as a pastor who cares for this particular fellowship of believers, as a human being in general, I have had a very tumultuous relationship with the book of Revelation. It's a tough one, isn't it? And I'm not alone either. I was listening to this podcast, this lectionary podcast yesterday. Usually it's just a little review of all the scriptures that the lectionary gives you. And they were interviewing this theologian from the southern part of the United States. And she was talking about the scripture from John and the Psalm and things like that. And we get down to Revelation and she says, yeah, Revelation, that's kind of a hard book. And then she came up with something maybe about a minute for that. I love the book of Revelation, but I am not alone in my tumultuous relationship with it, because it's a hard book to understand. In fact, Protestant reformer Martin Luther didn't even think that things should be in the canon of the New Testament. He would just have rather had it not there at all. But see, I like it. Part of the problem that we have with this book is where it directs people's attention. You have some seriously scary images in this book, accompanied by very ominous warnings. This is how the book ends. Listen to this. I warn everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this book. If anyone adds to them, God will add to that person the plagues described in this book. And if anyone takes away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God will take away that person's share in the tree of life. No wonder people don't want to read it if it says that, right? Ignorance is bliss, I guess. Oh, this is a fascinating book. But throughout the history of the church, especially in the last century, there are folks who have become obsessed with understanding its meaning, with unlocking the mysteries in this prophecy. And so, they've come up with questions like, when is the Great Tribulation? And are we living in the Great Tribulation right now? And what about this rapture? What's that all about? Am I going to be one of the ones who get caught up in the rapture so I don't have to face all this calamity? Or am I going to be one of the ones who are left behind to face all the calamities? Who is this beast? Who is this Antichrist that this book talks about? And are they alive and active in the world today? Could it be one of our current world leaders? Could it be one of our leaders to be? What is this mark of the beast? And if by having a Costco American Express card, am I sending myself to hell every time I go down there and fill up my tank? What does this mean? And it gets ridiculous sometimes. Early on in my journey of faith, I kid you not, it was about my junior year in high school. So this was the early 80s, early to mid 80s. And I went to a church and this preacher was preaching on the book of Revelation. And he said that then President Ronald Wilson Reagan might be the Antichrist because his first, middle, and last name each had 6 letters in it. And, 666, the mark of the beast, and all of that. And he says, how many people do you know who have 6 letters in each of their names? And you can just see all the people in the doing math on their fingers. And then every couple of years, I receive the letter. And the letter comes to all clergy people. All people. Have you ever got the letter, Katie? Oh my gosh, this is so cool. The letter is something that a preacher at least once in their career, maybe several times, gets. The letter is this multi-page document that explains how we are living in the end times. And it is loaded with tons of examples of the evidence that's all around us that proves we are living right here, right now, in these times that's described in the book of Revelation. And this letter has been copied multiple times to the point where the typeface is so deteriorated because of replicate fading that you can barely read it. But if the typeface, the printed part, isn't enough, every single square inch of white space in the margins has handwritten notes put in by whoever, people who have passed this on before, mostly scripture references to provide additional information that will further protect you from the fires of hell. And the funny thing is that there is no information about who to contact to learn more about gaining this fire insurance or whatever they're trying to have here. It just comes in the mail as is, and you're supposed to pass it along, which now that I think about it actually accounts for the replicate fading. But the message is clear. Repent so that you will receive the reward of heaven and avoid the punishment of this lake of fire or whatever. Karl Marx once called religion the opium of the masses, and that was a very negative thing to say. He believed religion was nothing more than a painkiller that was administered by the powers that be to those whose lives that are so awful that they would passively accept the status quo so long as they believed that it was all of these calamities was God's will for them. In other words, keep the masses ignorant to keep them in line. Religion, he argued, with all of its promises of pie in the sky when you die, takes people's attention off the injustices of this world and keeps folks preoccupied with being good, faithful churchgoers so that they'll be rewarded in the next world. And so religion is about chasing the carrot. But you can't have the carrot without the stick. Exactly. And I think the book of Revelation has been used far too often as a stick to scare people into compliance. So what I want to do is talk about this book as an inspiring example of faith under pressure and what it must have been like for a seriously oppressed people. I mean seriously oppressed, not, I can't hold prayer meetings on my public school type persecution. I'm talking real, our lives are in danger persecution. And how a people who are oppressed can live faithfully and victoriously even with that kind of persecution going on. Marx believed that religion was created and written by oppressors for the ones they oppress. But the book of Revelation is actually the product of a community of faith that was being oppressed. And it was written so that the oppressors wouldn't know what the oppressed were up to. Revelation is an example of apocalyptic literature. And we've really messed up the meaning of the word apocalypse, though, because the word simply means in the Greek to reveal that which is hidden. It does not mean calamity or destruction or chaos or anything, which unfortunately is how we've redefined it. In fact, we've got a good example coming up here next month about the misuse of that word. There's a movie called X-Men Apocalypse. We're both on an X-Men thing today, aren't we, Joe? Great movie series. But when you watch the trailers to this movie, you're introduced to a supervillain named Apocalypse. And he gathers up these 4 superpowered servants to be his 4 horsemen, which is not very gender-inclusive language considering that 2 of them are women, but they're still, the 4 horsemen of apocalypse. Scary stuff. Now, how many of you would be shaking in your boots if a supervillain named to reveal that which is hidden came to town? You know, that wouldn't be scary at all. But apocalypse? Oh yeah, boy, that that conjures up all sorts of scary images. But only because we have redefined that word and we've made it scary. Now, it just so happens that all apocalyptic literature contains scary images and scary predictions for future disasters, so it's an honest mistake. It's an honest misinterpretation. It happens. But here's the connection. Almost all examples of apocalyptic literature are written by and come out of communities that are being oppressed. All apocalyptic literature declares that the world and all of its ruling powers are evil and corrupt, and that God will bring those ruling powers to a fiery end. And of course, the faithful followers of God who remain faithful to God will be spared from or will be able to escape this fiery end. Now, if you were a ruler of one of these empires, in the time period this apocalyptic literature was written, if you were a part of the rulers of Babylon or Persia or Rome, how would you feel about a piece of literature produced by people who you're trying to keep under control that declares the destruction of your empire? You wouldn't feel too good about that, wouldn't you? That would not go over well at all. And so these rulers, you'd think, would probably do everything they could to squash the authors of such a book and get rid of that kind of literature. But what if the authors didn't call out the oppressors by name? What if they used some crazy, fantastical image of way in the future events, or maybe way in the past events, but let's, Book of Revelation, all way in the future, and all these images that just seem so strange and fantastical. What if they used that kind of imagery to tell their story? In modern day literature, what maybe we would call that kind of literature? Comic books. Okay, or a genre of science fiction. Exactly. Okay. You think you're reading a story about wizards from the past or space aliens from the future or galactic empires that try to squash Rebel Alliance heroes, but really those things are symbols or codes for something else, something that's happening right here and right now. So, what do you think the Star Wars saga is about? Is it about the journey of Anakin Skywalker into the dark side and his eventual redemption through his son Luke, or with the help of his son Luke? Or is it about an evil empire that arose because a representative republic decided to give control to an emperor and the disaster that happened after that? Well, the answer is yes to both. See, science fiction can be so subversive. And you can build the same case for biblical books like Ezekiel and Joel and parts of Daniel and, of course, this book that they call the Revelation of John. They are examples of enormously subversive literature that kind of thumbs its nose at the ruling powers that happen to be in power at the time. What makes this kind of literature great is that the ruling powers may not understand what the real meaning is, but the insiders, they get it. They get it. So now, this is where I need you to work with me a little bit here, okay? Let's entertain the possibility that the book of Revelation is an example of Mediterranean classical antiquity age science fiction. Okay? Can you work with me on that? So looking at it through this lens, what's the book about? What's the central message of the book? Well, let's say things might seem bad from where you're looking, but only because you can't see the big picture. It's just a passing tribulation. God is giving birth to a new world, a new reign, and you're part of it. God is in control, and you are one of God's chosen people, so just hang in there, stay faithful, tough it out, and in the end, you'll be fine. Okay, but what if it's not? What if it is some crazy prediction of the future events that is to be taken literally? What's the central message then? Same thing. Hang in there. Be faithful. Know that things are rough and may get rougher. But in the end, God's reign prevails. Now I believe that it's the product of the 1st and 2nd century church, and that the events in the book describe what was going on in the early church under the reigns of maybe Emperor Nero, maybe even Vespasian or Titus, one of those emperors that was really putting pressure on the church. And there are some great books out there that make a fine case for this interpretation. And you know what? If you think that's the case too, then okay, we've got something to talk about over lunch, right? We have something in common. But you know what? If you don't agree with that interpretation, if you think it's something else, something more predictive in nature, fine by me. We can agree to disagree and say that there's a common theme no matter how you look at that book. But for heaven's sake, please don't spend every waking moment obsessing over all of the whens and wheres and whys and whos, and am I going to burn for eternity if I use my Visa to get back cashback rewards when I buy a television at Best Buy, right? When we do that, I believe it turns our attention towards self-preservation instead of promoting the good news that God's reign is at hand. So don't let obsessing over one book in the Bible take you away from living out the good news in your words and deeds right now. So, here's a word of encouragement and hope for you right out of the passage that Joe read this morning in chapter 1. This passage doesn't just say that Jesus had freed us from our sin and made us citizens of a new kingdom, a kingdom which is not of this world. It goes beyond that and says that Jesus has made us priests in the service of God. Priests. Okay, so what? Well, priests are the ones who stand in the middle of two reigns. There's the reign of heaven and the reign of earth. And they represent each to one another. When we join with Christ in his priestly ministry, we represent the world to God and God to the world. And we are active agents of reconciling the two. We are not being called out of this world to simply write it off as irrelevant. We are being called to stand on that threshold between the two in order to bring the world into line with this realm of God, this reign of God. And you know what? That is a heck of a place to be. But it's where we stand every time we gather here for worship. We stretch ourselves between these two realms, and we seek to bring them together. We, as the priesthood of all believers, and remember, that's one of the things that we assert, that we hold on to as disciples of Christ. As a priesthood of all believers, we bring the needs of the world in prayer to our God. And we take the ordinary things of this earth, like bread and wine and fire and water and oil. We bring those things here as representatives of God, active agents of reconciliation. We allow these elements to speak to us about God's presence among us. Because that's when the kids come down and light that candle, that light reminds us that Christ is here with us. You see how this priesthood thing works? It's awesome. And what this book, the Revelation of John, is telling us as we listen to it over the next few weeks is that this is not just some escape from reality. This is not some opiate for the masses. It is real life expression of God's mission of reconciling these two realms, heaven and earth. Just like the community that produced Revelation, we might feel small and insignificant up against seemingly insurmountable odds. But our faithful stance between heaven and earth is part of a much bigger picture in which our faith and our faithfulness is part of bringing about this new reign. This reign of love and mercy and justice and peace.
I am so very, very sorry.
Aww.
In the case of the Popular Society of the United States of America versus the First Christian Church of Chico, we are ready to render the following judgments. That FCC Chico did freely feed the hungry without regard to religious affiliation or any other condition, we find you guilty as charged. That FCC Chico opened its doors to the unshelterable homeless for warmth, safety, and fellowship, we find you guilty as charged.
Yeah.
That FCC Chico knowingly supported community shelters and programs through donations of food, supplies, and time and talent, we find you guilty as charged. Yeah. That FCC Chico extends its membership and opens its doors to all and meets them where they are at, we find you guilty as charged. Yeah. Finally, and most seriously, that FCC Chico has followed the subversive order, as I have loved you, love one another, from a religious radical and zealot from over 2,000 years ago, we find you guilty as charged. Yay. Good job.